Thank you again, all of you, for being here. My name is Jody Lastman, and I'm the Director of Marketing with Park People. Today, we're really excited to be launching the 4th Annual Canadian City Parks Report with an exclusive funder and partner event. The people in the organizations who are here joining us today are really our key supporters, and the 2022 Canadian City Parks Report is all about relationships and reciprocity. And in that spirit, just want to convey that we simply couldn't do our work in parks and in communities without your important support and the important relationships that we hold with all of you. This invitation-only event is going to give you a first glimpse of the report in just a small way, and it's just a small way for us to thank you for all that you've done and continue to do for Park People. Today, you're going to join a short presentation that's going to highlight the key findings, the top stories and insights from this year's Canadian City Parks Report from our 3 report authors, Adri, Emily, and Jake. And it'll be followed by discussion and an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So jot them down as we're going through. We encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or use the chat function to connect with each other. It's a small group, so we hope we can have a great dialogue and discussion that this kind of format permits. A little bit about Park People. We're committed to ensuring that city parks support healthy and resilient communities and ecosystems, particularly in equity-deserving communities. And what a year it's been. Parks have been absolutely vital in 2022 and continue to play an essential role in nurturing and repairing relationships between ourselves, our communities, and the wider natural world. Of course, in the context of today's discussion, it feels particularly important to recognize the legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of many urban parks and public spaces, and the historical role of urban planning in settler colonialism and dispossession. In this conversation and in our work, it is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to the land. So in that spirit, I would like to open today's webinar by acknowledging the land that we're gathered on and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of all. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, which is home to Park People's head office. Park People acknowledges that the land we call home sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We're thrilled today to be joined by 3 amazing panelists and the report's authors, Jake Tobin Garrett, Adri Stark, and Emily Riddle. Adri is a senior project manager specializing in research and policy at Park People, and is co-author of the annual Canadian City Parks Report. She leads Park People's research on encampments and has co-authored reports on the social impacts of parks, how we can cultivate a sense of belonging in public space, and more. Emily is a member of Alexander First Nation in Treaty 6. She is a writer, editor, public library worker, and researcher. She sits on the board of advisors for the Yellowhead Institute, a First Nations-led think tank. And Jake is a writer, illustrator, and public space policy and research consultant. He was previously Park People's manager of policy and planning and continues to work with Park People as a consultant. These are, I assure you, some of the smartest people working on city parks in Canada and maybe North America and maybe the world. I'm constantly amazed by their dedication to the report and their deep knowledge of city parks. We are truly so lucky to have their expertise on the Park People team and with us today. They will now walk you through some of the key findings and top insights from this year's Canadian City Parks report. Over to you, Adri.
Thanks so much for opening it up, Jody, and thank you all for joining us. It's a bit of an intimate group today, but really nice to be among Park People friends to share a preview of the report before our public launch on Thursday. So for those of you who are new to the Canadian City Parks report, each year the report tracks trends and challenges in city parks across the country, and this is our 4th year of the report. The goal is really to share Canadian practices, establish a common database, and inspire action by spotlighting creative solutions to some of the most pressing issues facing parks each year. And this year's report includes data, policies, and practices from our survey of parks departments in 30 cities across the country, all the way from Vancouver, BC on the west coast to Charlottetown, PEI in the east. And it also draws on data from our public survey of over 3,000 residents of Canadian cities to understand the public's experiences in parks over the past year. And then in addition to the surveys, we also conduct interviews with over 30 experts, including community members, activists, city staff, landscape architects, academics, and nonprofit organizations to dig deeper into different perspectives on park issues. And so this is all to say that the report is really a collaborative effort between ourselves, city staff, and the experts who take the time to speak with us. So just want to recognize all of the folks who make the report possible. And this also, of course, includes our funders. So a huge thank you to the Weston Family Foundation. They've not only funded this year's report, but all 4 years. And without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this work. We also want to thank RBC Insurance, Norton Rose Fulbright, and Mohari Hospitality for their support. So as you can imagine, there's a lot in this report and we won't get to everything today. But Emily, Jake, and I are just going to open things up with an overview of some key findings before we move into our discussion. So as many of us have probably observed, throughout the pandemic, we've seen higher levels of park use. And this is really a key trend we've documented in the past 2 years of the Canadian City Parks report. And we're seeing this continue into 2022. So 55% of city residents told us they spent more time in parks this past year than the year prior. And on top of that, 58% actually said that they'd like to spend more time in parks than they currently do. Similarly, people are continuing to appreciate the benefits of parks. So 94% of city residents reported that parks improved their mental health in the past year, which is actually up almost 10% from 85% last year. And what this tells us is that this increased use and appreciation of parks that began sort of early in the pandemic is very much showing itself to be a sustained trend. And this may be related to the fact that many people discovered new uses of parks during the pandemic. So 93% of city residents said that they started a new activity in parks during COVID that they're still doing now, including things like going for more frequent walks along trails, eating outdoors, meeting up with friends in parks, and so on. So people picked up all of these new park routines that have really stuck and sort of become ongoing, lasting parts of their everyday lives.
Thanks, Adri, and hi, everyone. I also wanted to acknowledge Nikita Longman, who's another co-author and isn't on this webinar. So we know that people have sought out nature more during the pandemic for rest, relaxation, stress reduction, exercise. Nearly half of survey respondents said that a new activity they picked up during the pandemic was spending more time in natural areas. And also 54% of residents said that they visit wild or naturalized park spaces most often, which is actually up by 20% from our 2021 survey. So as you can imagine, this translates to a pretty large number of folks who are now spending more time seeking out experiences of nature in the city. And it's interesting, it's not just the large natural areas either. In fact, 71% of respondents said they sought out smaller naturalized spaces, so like native plant gardens or small meadows that are within a 10-minute walk of their home. And I think to me, this really highlights the importance of naturalizing spaces within neighborhoods close to people's homes, which also of course helps increase urban biodiversity, creates natural habitat for urban wildlife, and there's a whole host of climate benefits from that in terms of stormwater management and mitigating heat. As a result of all this increased contact with nature, it's actually leading to more interest in folks giving back through natural stewardship. So 59% of cities said that they had created new or expanded their existing nature stewardship programs to meet this new demand. And one city actually said that they had to pause intake of volunteers because the program that they have is so popular. So there's a really big opportunity here for cities and organizations to and funders to connect people more to the natural environment in their cities and really help facilitate this interest in giving back. And I'll just hand it over to Emily.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, Nikita Longman and I were really honored to be guest contributors to this year's report and write stories for the inclusion section. And our 2 stories covered topics such as engaging with Indigenous leadership generally. My article is specifically about Indigenous plants in urban parks. Naming was a big topic as well in Nikita's article, and renaming, and ceremonial sites too. So I'm in Edmonton and I'll always plug our kind of leadership in Kechiaski, which is a ceremonial site that's actually opening this fall in Edmonton in a public park. So throughout our 2 articles in the inclusion section, there's a lot of work being done in collaboration with Indigenous communities in Canada in terms of parks, but also a lot of work to still be done. It's notable in the surveys, which you can see on this slide, that we found that 68% of respondents would like to see more Indigenous representation in parks, and that 59% of city residents are in favor of renaming parks to restore Indigenous place names, which is something that's happening throughout the country in waves. Thank you.
So now talking about paying for it, one of the printout issues we've seen over the last 4 years that we've done this report is the impact of tight budgets and aging infrastructure. This is always the top concern from cities when we ask them. And this year we learned that while the pandemic didn't reduce park budgets in like real dollar terms, it did cause more pressure by necessitating that those same dollars stretch even further to cover a whole host of new things related to public health, like ensuring physical distancing requirements are being met, and extra sanitation, higher maintenance costs from increased park use. And we heard that some of these effects are going to likely linger and impact parks for years as well. So 93% of cities said the pandemic has impacted capital budgets in some way by either delaying park improvement projects, increasing the timelines for things, or increasing the cost of materials, so making park construction itself more expensive. One of the positive notes here is that there is actually really high support for increased park funding from the public. So nearly 90% of city residents want more public funding for parks, especially for maintenance and for higher quality designs. And this is a really high number, same high number that we saw last year as well. So a lot of stability in that support. The other interesting thing is that many cities are pushing forward with equity-focused park investment plans that take into account elements other than just development growth. So looking at things like demographics, socioeconomic status, and climate impact concerns, and thinking about where to invest in parks. And this type of planning is going to be even more important in an era of potentially tight budgets because it can help prioritize investment to where it's most needed.
So park engagement is one area that the pandemic has really turned on its head. With traditional in-person methods like town halls becoming impossible, cities have been forced to get creative. 92% of cities told us that the pandemic has changed the way they engage communities on park projects. And this, of course, includes a heavier reliance on virtual methods like web-based engagement platforms, social media, and some hybrid methods like placing QR codes in parks. And some cities told us that these methods have allowed them to connect with new and broader audiences compared to traditional in-person consultations. But through our public survey, we heard that just 22% of city residents felt that they have a voice or ability to influence what goes on in their local park. So it's clear that these new methods aren't working for everyone. And the main barriers to participation that survey respondents mentioned included being unsure how to get involved, unsure whether their participation would make a difference, and having a lack of time to participate. And notably, these barriers were disproportionately experienced by respondents who identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. But on a more promising note, the hard work of community advocates to raise awareness around inequities during the pandemic has really pushed some cities forward. So 35% of cities said that they are prioritizing more intentional outreach to equity deserving groups as a result of sort of increased awareness around equity issues during the pandemic. And cities are beginning to recognize that this requires new approaches. So we're starting to see cities think more critically about finding ways to share power with communities, including a shift towards deeper ongoing relationship building with residents, rather than simply engaging on a sort of one-off project by project basis. Another topic we explore in the report is houselessness. So encampments have, of course, become much more visible during the pandemic, with not only sort of the economic fallout, but also new pressures in the shelter system around capacity limits and public health requirements. And this is something we explored in depth in our 2020 Canadian City Parks report, sort of right at the start of the pandemic. And in that report, we highlighted how cities can move towards more inclusive approaches to sheltering in parks. But unfortunately, 2 years later, we're still seeing that parks departments are really struggling in responding to this issue. So 70% of cities noted that they're overwhelmed with managing public complaints related to encampments. 56% said that they feel they lack adequate knowledge or training to respond to houselessness issues. And 48% told us that they lack an overarching strategic vision for engaging with encampments beyond just managing day-to-day realities. So in this context where parks departments are feeling really ill-equipped to respond to this issue, we're continuing to see surveillance and enforcement-based approaches dominate. So we asked cities about strategies that they use to respond to encampments, and 76% said that they use bylaw enforcement. 66% said that they use crime prevention through environmental design, also known as cette, which is a design strategy that aims to prevent crime and maintain order in public space, but it often has the effect of targeting survival behaviors. So for example, benches with middle armrests that prevent people from lying down. And all of this is compared to only 10% of cities that said that they actually engage directly with unhoused communities on park projects. So it's clear that there's a lot of work to be done here in shifting towards more human rights-based approaches. But on a more promising note, in our survey of the Canadian public, we actually found that 62% of city residents who had noticed an encampment in their park said that it did not negatively impact their park use. So in other words, the majority of people are actually okay with sharing space with their unhoused neighbors in parks. And this really challenges the perception that when a park is home to an encampment, it somehow becomes off limits to others. It highlights that people are more open to sharing space than we might think. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jody to kick off our conversation.
Thank you so much, Adri. There's certainly a whole lot to dig into, and I really thank you so much, the three of you, for leading the conversation and giving us a little bit of a taste of what we can learn more about in the Canadian City Parks report. It is a very, very important conversation for us to be hosting today, and we're really grateful to have you three with us to be able to answer some of our questions. I'm going to kick it off with asking you, the three of you, to please share your thoughts on what you see as the key trends or the findings that you think that funders and partners that are here with us, joining us today, really need to understand and be aware of around city parks in 2022, based on your learnings from the report.
I'll start. So I think for me, it's the amount of people who seem to have sort of almost discovered their love for nature or spending more time in these naturalized areas in cities in a new way during the pandemic. I know I spent a lot more time in those spaces in the last couple of years. But really, again, like I said during the presentation, how that's sort of turning into a desire to kind of give back. And we've seen some cities already kind of like bump up against the limits of what they have available in terms of programs that they offer for nature stewardship or education, or like the ability for folks to kind of maybe pull invasive species or learn a little bit more about the natural environment around them. So I definitely think there's an opening for funders to begin to like work with cities, work with community level organizations to address sort of equitable access to nature programming and stewardship opportunities. I think there's a lot of interest in that right now across the country.
I guess for me, one of the things that really stood out in thinking about engaging with Indigenous nations is just the low, like 22% of people knowing how to engage with civic processes in terms of influencing city parks. So, and that's probably even less if you're looking at equity seeking groups like Indigenous people who live in urban spaces and not knowing how to engage in terms of municipal politics and those kind of processes, I think is really stark. And then also trying to think about how our cities or municipalities engaging with Indigenous nations in diplomacy, because that is what that is too. But I think it is positive to see folks are interested in renaming and more Indigenous representation in parks in general. I mean, I wish those stats were 90%, but I think they're slowly rising, I would say, over the past 5 years in kind of an anecdotal way I can observe.
Yeah, I think for me, I would just pick up on sort of the last section of the presentation around encampments. It just is so clear that this is an issue that cities continue to struggle with. And it's relatively new that parks departments are actually seeing housing issues as sort of within their mandate. So for example, in Vancouver, the park board just created a new position called the Director of Urban Relationships, which is a role that's focused entirely on engaging with encampment residents and community partners to ensure that the work that the park board is doing is sort of informed by deep consultation with this very important constituency of park users. And so I think like a key area of focus that I would just encourage folks to be aware of is sort of trying to provide more strategies or toolkits or resources to help park professionals in engaging with houselessness, just because it is a knowledge gap for many people who are coming from like a natural resource management background and might not really know much about social work or poverty or trauma, and just ensuring that frontline parks workers feel a little bit more supported in this area.
Jody, before I move on, can I just pick up on something Emily said real quick? I think Emily, like pointing out that 20%, or I can't remember the exact stat, of folks who didn't feel like they could influence what happened in their park. Adri, maybe you can remind me, but like I feel like we pulled that last year, and the stat this year was actually less than it was last year. So that it's actually gone down in the last year, which like maybe somewhat not surprising in a still kind of pandemic era where folks are doing more online engagements. And so it's maybe perhaps difficult to feel like you can have an influence, but I feel like that's something to watch, you know, city staff and others who are engaging with the public in parks, that right now it seems to be kind of like at an all-time low for people feeling like they can influence what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Because this presentation was so focused on some of the key data pieces, I'd like to kind of open up an opportunity to talk about the stories a bit, because they are so rich and so powerful. And to all of those of you who are planning on reading the report, I really encourage you to dig deep into those stories, because there's so much really inspiration there in terms of how we can do parks better. And I want to invite each of you, if you can, to please, if you could highlight one story or conversation that really resonated with you, and just share a little bit about the expert you spoke with and what really stuck with you about that particular story. Emily, are you okay to start?
I can start. One of the people that I interviewed for my story was Elder Cecilia Brooks, who does work in Fredericton, so very far from where I live. She does tours of Indigenous plants in city parks and works to preserve species that are there. So what I found most interesting about my interview with her is she really laid out a process for both conservation and reclamation of Indigenous plants, and talked about how in order to preserve plants in parks might mean that we close certain spots in them as well. And that's something I think a lot, I work in public libraries, and parks are public spaces. And for Indigenous people, we think about how open access isn't always relevant to our cultures and necessary. So like some knowledge you only get through certain processes and protocols. And in the same way, maybe it makes sense to close certain parts of city parks in order to preserve these Indigenous plants, or to plant them again too. And that requires that we don't interact with those public spaces for a certain amount of time. So that was something that was really amazing, her kind of passion about that work in Fredericton.
Thanks. Thank you, Emily. Adri?
Yeah, so I will share that I cried during multiple interviews with experts because we got to speak to some really amazing people. And one of those conversations was with someone named Robbie Epp, who is a founder of Sweetgrass Clan that works out of the downtown east side in Vancouver. And Sweetgrass Clan is an Indigenous-led community safety effort that sort of just provides outreach and culturally appropriate, I guess, services to folks sort of who are street involved or just maybe using substances. And anyway, so I just was really inspired by our conversation because he related the approach that they take back to traditional teachings around the importance of talking to people and showing people respect and really empathizing with people versus using sort of violence or enforcement-based approaches to deal with some of the challenges that we see in parks. And for me, it was just a really inspiring and concrete sort of tangible example of different approaches to policing, which has been sort of, you know, like a big conversation in recent years around defunding the police. It reminded me that there are these very concrete alternatives to promote community safety in much sort of healthier ways that actually make people feel safe. So that was a really important conversation for me.
Yeah, for me, almost everyone I talked to spoke about approaching our relationship with nature in a more intentional and kind of mindful way, which is something that really stuck with me just because like often I go outside a lot and I experience nature, but like I'm listening to a podcast sometimes or like music, and like you really don't get the same kind of like sensory experience of nature that the people I was interviewing were talking about, where, you know, we rush through a space and we don't really take the time to notice things like how they smell and like what they feel like and listening to the sounds around us. And it's just like such a different experience when you start to do that. And then the other thing that something more specific that stuck with me was with an interview with Zamani Ra, who's an environmental educator in Toronto. And she made the point, which seems very simple, but I think we often forget, is just like that we are nature ourselves. And that even when we're in our own homes, you know, we're connected to nature because we are nature, right? Like we can feel, she was talking about being able to feel the sun on your face, you know, breathing in the air around you. And again, it's such a simple thing, but I think we forget about it quite a bit. And it really helped me actually 2 months ago when I had COVID and I was like inside my house for 10 days. And I just remembered what Zamani was talking about. And so instead of kind of like feeling sad that I couldn't go outside, I was just focusing on like what I could experience from my apartment, and it really helped. So that definitely stuck with me.
Thank you. And I'm gonna just in the chat here, Andreas has a question about something that surprised you from the report. Anything unexpected that you learned or caught your attention in the process of writing the report? Maybe Adri, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So this year's report got me thinking a lot about safety, as I sort of just mentioned, and what that means to different people. And one thing that really struck me is sort of in conversation with people with lived experience of houselessness, I learned that the entire sort of like dominant approach to planning for safety around promoting, you know, like Jane Jacobs' idea of eyes on the street, where neighbors can sort of keep tabs on one another, is actually really not what folks experiencing homelessness are looking for. They're looking for more like private spaces within parks, you know, like visual protection from bushes, actual dark areas in parks where they can sleep comfortably. And so for me, it just was a really important reminder that what might make me feel safe in a park is not necessarily what makes everyone feel safe. And definitely got me interested in exploring that topic further.
Emily?
My particular story was on Indigenous plants. So I guess it was surprising to me the big range of leadership by municipalities in this area, from doing the most and actually engaging with Indigenous nations, or cities who have made commitments that they're not fulfilling in terms of engaging with Indigenous peoples in relation to plants too. And I guess it doesn't surprise me, but I think that a lot of the really good work that's happening in this area and in sort of the projects that Nikita talked about too are happening on the prairies, which is not often seen as like a progressive area within Canada. But I think Indigenous nations are doing a lot of good work in Regina and Winnipeg and Edmonton.
Mine is a more simple one. There was one stat that really struck me. Like, we already knew park use was really high. There were a lot of people that have been using parks more than they have been, in the last 2 years. But one of the stats from the survey was that 58% of respondents said that they were dissatisfied with the amount of time they spent in parks because they wanted to spend more time in parks. So like, we're already at like historic highs probably for park use across the country, and like 60% of people want to spend more time in parks. So that to me like was kind of surprising. Just that there's like, we haven't hit a ceiling yet, I guess, in terms of like the amount of time people want to spend in parks. But it also made me think, and it would be great to ask this next year, like, what are the barriers that people, like, what are the reasons why they aren't spending the time they want to spend in parks? Is it because they don't have enough time? Is it because they don't have access to those spaces that they want to go to? Is it there's a lack of kind of like appropriate amenities there or something? So I feel like there's like a really interesting story there. But it's on the face of it, it's just kind of amazing that there's, people still want to spend more time, even though we're already at kind of these historic highs.
Thanks. If I can just ask one more question, and please, I encourage all of those who are in attendance with us today, if you have a question, feel free to pop it into the Q&A or to the chat. But definitely wanted to chat about the theme in terms of nurturing relationships and reciprocity. Thinking about, just the theme itself and how it sort of presented itself within the context of the report and the stories that you worked on. How do you now think about those terms and how they resonate within the report itself? This time we'll start with Jake. That's okay.
So I did most of my stuff on nature connection, obviously, and I've read a lot of reports and kind of like studies about nature connection and time in nature before, and the benefits of nature are often always written about what nature can do for us, right? It's like a human-centered kind of personal well-being narrative, like, oh, it can lower our stress and all that. And I've absolutely been guilty of kind of positioning it that way as well. But this year, my conversations with folks, it was a good reminder that's kind of an extractive way of thinking about nature, and that we need to think about it more as this kind of reciprocal relationship. And in particular, Carolyn Crawley, who I interviewed for one of my nature stories, who's an Indigenous forest therapy guide. She's a storyteller. She's also an educator who runs her own consulting practice. After I finish speaking, I'll drop the link to it in the chat. She said this great quote that I think about a lot, which is, we have an individual and collective responsibility to be in a good relationship with the earth, just as well as being in a good relationship with ourselves and each other. And I think about that a lot because it's really simple, but this really powerful idea that we have to nurture a relationship with the earth and other beings around us, as the same as we do nurture relationships with our loved ones, our spouse, our family, our friends, and that these kind of healthy relationships are built on this idea of reciprocity and respect. So that was something that has really stuck with me, and it sort of changed the way that I think about researching and writing about nature now.
Thanks. Adri?
Yeah, coming back to this 22% stat that we keep mentioning around the percentage of people who feel they have a voice or ability to influence decision-making in their local park. One of the experts I spoke with was Dr. Alex Flynn, who's a prof at UBC and an expert in municipal governance issues. And she really pointed out that it's not just the format, but also sort of the quality of public engagement that's been impacted by COVID. So cities have sort of been putting out a lot of pilot projects to respond to urgent needs, but often in these contexts, engagement is rushed or bypassed altogether. And I don't think it's unrelated that we've seen parks used as spaces of protest and pushback a lot over the past couple of years. I think communities are really expressing that they don't feel that they have strong relationships with cities and that the existing processes aren't working for them. And so I think a lot about healing those relationships and sort of recognizing those fractures that do exist. There's some really exciting sort of new work happening in this space. So for example, in Edmonton, where Emily is from, the city is leading a project called Recover. And each year they do a series of social prototypes that sort of pilot new ways of engaging communities. And it often takes place in parks and public spaces. And this year they launched a project called Oracle, which saw 10 community members in an equity deserving neighborhood hired as what they called local listeners. And so their job was basically to go out and engage other neighbors to learn about what well-being meant to them. And then they shared back all of these stories at a community festival where community members were able to actually interpret the stories themselves and give the city advice on how they thought that this information should be used. So I just thought that was a really inspiring model of what relationships between cities and communities could look like, where instead of engaging sort of, again, coming back to Jake's point around like extractive approaches where you're just sort of like wanting information from a community to achieve a specific city goal, thinking about it instead in terms of allowing the community to like actually direct the city's priorities a little bit from the outset. So that was an important theme that stuck out to me.
Thank you. And Emily?
I think a lot about it, reciprocity. It's like a big part of like our language and our laws as Plains Cree people. Reciprocity, as someone who works on the Indigenous framework with the City of Edmonton on the committee, it's about engaging with Indigenous processes too. I think Indigenous people are always asked to like come all the way over here instead of meeting in the middle, or even like maybe non-Indigenous people have to move further over to where we are and understand where we're coming from, and that we have our own processes of doing things and meeting and projects like that. My article was specifically about Indigenous plants. So I think you can't engage with reclamation of Indigenous plants or biodiversity without engaging with elders and knowledge keepers that have that knowledge and that are able to relay why it is important and the processes of reclaiming those plants too. And I thought a lot about with Elder Cecilia Brooks and Joanne Saddleback, who's an elder that I work with at the library actually, about, we talk about, we had only like one kind of treaty throughout the entire continent, was that Creator made everything perfect, leave it as is. And so we had all these kind of technologies for maintaining biodiversity. And so these plants that are in city parks or other areas, like they have a right to be there, just like Indigenous people have a right to be in the city, occupying space, whether that's in encampments or as people living and utilizing park spaces in other ways too.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for your incredible work and your insights. It's interesting just in that each of you have kind of delved deep into like a kind of a particular focus area, which obviously lends itself to discoveries and questions and learnings that are going to hopefully inform the next iteration of the report next year. I'm particularly moved by thinking about how like all three of you have raised, you know, how writing the report has kind of facilitated a shift in your thinking to some extent. And I think that that's what we're hoping everybody will find within the report, is a kind of a new lens on how we think about parks, whether it be in terms of reconciliation, in terms of indigeneity, in terms of safety, and in terms of our relationship with nature. Like all of those things, I think, have been really powerfully represented in the report. So thank you for your excellent work, and for being here. And I want to thank all of you who are great supporters of Park People's work, and we hope that the report is going to provide you with insight and inspiration to move forward with your work. All of you know, this is really about keeping your communities connected, keeping them inspired, and keeping them safe. And we're really proud that you're able to support us in doing that in our communities, and in part through this report. We're really grateful for you joining us today, and thank you for being here. And I really do encourage you to please enjoy the report, share the report, delve deep, and if you have other questions for us, by all means reach out. We would be delighted to talk to you about anything that kind of sparks your imagination. But thank you very much, particularly to the report writers for joining us and for so thoughtfully crafting a really powerful new message about city parks.